The corridors of Rome's Palatine Palace are loud with sandals and shouts, and the emperor is suddenly running for his life. On January 24th AD 41, Gaius Caesar, Caligula, moves through the covered passages that link the palace to the theaters and imperial seating, expecting applause, not steel. Sources disagree about the exact doorway and the very first blow, but the outline is steady. A tribune of the Praetorian Guard named Cassius strikes, others surge in, and Caligula falls beneath repeated stabs. The killing is swift, close, and meant to end a reign, not win a battle. In the moments after, Rome does what it always does when the center fails. Rumors outrun orders. Senators hurry to the curia, guards shout conflicting commands, and courtiers bolt doors that only yesterday stood open, as if it could stop politics. Caligula is only 28. He has ruled for less than 4 years. In March AD 37, when Tiberius died and the new princeps entered Rome, crowds had cheered him as the last adult male of Augustus' line and the son of Germanicus, the beloved commander whose name still made veterans straighten their backs on the Rhine. The first months of his reign brought public funerals, amnesties, and games. The city drank in relief. And yet we open with blood on palace stones. So what happened between hope and knives? Was Caligula truly a tyrant beyond measure, or did later writers turn political violence into a morality play? The ancient record is loud, but not always fair. Some episodes, executions, confiscations, humiliations, leave practical traces in careers and policy. Other stories, like talking to the moon or appointing a horse to office, may have grown in the retelling, sharpened by hatred, satire, or the simple safety of mocking a dead emperor. Our guides are imperfect. Suetonius loves vivid scandal. Cassius writes with the hindsight of a later empire. Josephus preserves the assassination amid his own concerns. Tacitus' narrative for these years is largely lost, leaving holes where we want firm ground. Coins and inscriptions are blunter. They show what the regime wanted public, not what it feared in private. If you enjoy calm, evidence-led history with vivid places and clear dates, please like the video and subscribe. To understand the violence of AD 41, we have to step back into the tense world that shaped Caligula before he ever wore a crown. The story begins in the shadowed last years of Tiberius, when Rome learned to whisper. On Capri, an old emperor watches the sea and listens for footsteps that might bring news, or a dagger. By the early AD 30s, Tiberius has withdrawn from Rome to his villas on the island, leaving the capital to feel ruled by absence and fear. In Rome, senators still meet in the curia, but many speak as if a shadow sits beside them. The Maesta's treason charges of the period are real enough in our sources, though the scale is debated. What matters is the atmosphere they describe: denunciations, sudden arrests, and families learning that a careless joke could become a death sentence. The fall of Sejanus in AD 31, once the powerful prefect of the Praetorian Guard, shows how fast fortune turns at the top. 1 month a man can command Rome's armed protectors. The next he can be dragged down and erased. This is the world Caligula inherits, a court trained to survive by guessing the emperor's mood. On the Palatine, proximity becomes a weapon. A nod at dinner can raise a senator. A frown can ruin him. The Praetorians, stationed close to the city, grow used to politics, not just protection. And the Julio-Claudian family itself is a tangle of claims. Augustus' bloodline, the Claudian branch, adopted sons, and ambitious in-laws all crowd around the same prize: legitimacy. Tiberius has one natural heir, his grandson Tiberius Gemellus, still a boy. Another option is Germanicus' son Gaius, already famous to the public. Gaius is young, but his father's reputation is gold, and his mother's suffering has made him a symbol for people who hated the palace purges. Over on Capri, Tiberius keeps both boys close, perhaps to test them, perhaps to control them. Behind closed doors, the prefect Naevius Sutorius Macro rises as Sejanus' replacement, and the guard's loyalty becomes the hinge. When Tiberius dies in March AD 37 at Misenum, near the Bay of Naples, the succession moves quickly. Later authors hint at suffocation or collusion, but the evidence is thin and the rumors are exactly what you expect after a suspicious old age. What we can see clearly is the result. The Senate and the Guard accept Gaius as princeps, and Rome celebrates as if a storm has passed. Suetonius and Dio paint Tiberius' court as poisonous. Tacitus, where he survives, supplies the bitter texture of senatorial fear. Coins from AD 37 show the new regime advertising continuity and hope. But the habits of the previous reign, watchfulness, flattery, and vengeance, do not vanish with the funeral smoke. A young emperor will soon discover that Rome applauds loudly, and judges even louder in private. A small boy trots after legionaries along the Rhine, his sandals cut like a soldier's boots, and hardened men laugh as if war has a mascot. Around AD 14 to 16, in the frontier camps of Germania Inferior, the child Gaius earns the nickname Caligula, Little Boots, because his mother dresses him in miniature military gear. His father is Germanicus Julius Caesar, adopted son of Tiberius and the most celebrated commander of his generation. At the Rhine camps, Germanicus calms mutinous troops after Augustus' death and leads punitive marches beyond the river. Soldiers chant his name. Crowds in Rome expect him to be the future. Gaius, carried through lines of shields, grows up with the smell of leather, wood smoke, and wet earth. In AD 19, Germanicus dies in the east, at Antioch, after a bitter quarrel with the governor of Syria, Gnaeus Piso. The family's supporters cry poison. Official inquiries move, but certainty never arrives. Agrippina the Elder, Germanicus' widow, brings the ashes back to Italy, and Rome turns the funeral into a public display of grief and anger. From that point, the household becomes dangerous to know. The imperial family is not just kin, it is a rival court. Over the next decade, the fall is brutal. Agrippina is exiled, then dies. Gaius' older brothers, Nero and Drusus, are accused and removed, dying in custody. The details of charges and timing vary between authors, but the direction is clear. Germanicus' line is cut down until the youngest son is all that remains. Gaius is spared, sent first to the care of relatives, then pulled toward the center of power. He watches how relatives vanish, how friends choose distance, and how survival often means silence. By the time he reaches adulthood, Caligula has learned two lessons that require no philosophy to see. First, in Rome, family fame is both shield and target. Second, the emperor's household is a stage where one wrong roll can be fatal. When he appears in public, people see Germanicus reborn. Inside the palace, others see a claimant with a dangerous name. Tacitus, where his text survives, gives the political storm around Germanicus. Suetonius preserves the frontier anecdotes. Dio summarizes the family purge with a senator's bitterness. Early inscriptions and later coinage keep Germanicus' memory alive as propaganda. Soon, the young survivor will be pulled to Capri, where the rules of staying alive become even sharper. On that island, every meal and every conversation will matter more than any battle. A young man lands on Capri and looks up at cliffs that seem to promise both safety and captivity. By the mid-AD 30s, Caligula lives close to Tiberius' retreat, moving through villas where a whispered joke can travel faster than a messenger. Tiberius is old, suspicious, and surrounded by favorites, freedmen, and guards. Later writers describe lurid entertainments on Capri, but these passages are exactly where we must slow down. Scandal sells, and hostile memory grows easily. What is firmer is the political setting. Caligula is not free to build his own power base. He is kept within reach, watched, and used as a counterweight to other claimants. He learns when to speak, when to smile, and when to let someone else take the blame for a sharp remark. The Praetorian prefect Macro becomes crucial. After Sejanus' fall, Macro needs a stable successor to protect his own position, and Caligula, with his famous name, looks useful. Caligula also makes alliances inside the imperial household. He honors Tiberius publicly, attends dinners, and gives the impression of gratitude. Suetonius claims Tiberius once said Caligula was rearing a viper for Rome. It is a perfect line, but we cannot prove it was spoken, and it may be the kind of prophecy later generations like to place in a dead man's mouth. In these years, Caligula marries Junia Claudia and loses her soon after, then remains in the orbit of the court. He watches his cousin Tiberius Gemellus grow, still officially an heir, yet too young to command soldiers or impress senators. Caligula also keeps his sisters close, Drusilla, Agrippina, and Julia Livilla, figures who will later matter in both gossip and politics. On Capri, family is not comfort, it is currency. Then comes March AD 37. Tiberius falls ill at Misenum, near the Bay of Naples, where fleets and villas crowd the shoreline. Rumors later insist Macro and Caligula hurried the end, even smothered the emperor. The story is impossible to confirm and fits a familiar pattern. When a ruler dies after years of fear, people assume murder. What we can say is that Macro and the guard move fast. The Senate accepts Caligula, and Gemellus is pushed aside with careful wording and little real power. Suetonius and Dio relish the Capri intrigue. Tacitus is absent for these final scenes. Josephus notes Macro's influence. The speed of the transition is reflected in public honors and early coin issues that suddenly shift to the new princeps. Caligula arrives in Rome with survival skills that have never been tested by open authority. Now the boy from the Rhine camps will discover what it means to be adored by a city that can also turn. In March AD 37, Rome's streets fill so tightly that the sound of cheering rolls like surf against the Forum. Caligula enters the capital as princeps, and people greet him less as a man than as a promise that Tiberius' long frost has ended. He begins with gestures meant to be seen. He stages lavish games at the circus and theaters, letting the city taste spectacle without fear of a sudden arrest. He honors his dead parents with public ceremonies and transfers of ashes, tying himself to Germanicus in the most Roman way, through rites and memory in public space. He recalls some exiles and speaks of ending the climate of informers. Suetonius says he burned damaging documents and opened the palace to freer access. Dio describes a young ruler performing clemency as a political reset. The Senate responds with eager flattery. Decrees pile up, titles, thanksgivings, honors for his family. Caligula accepts many, perhaps too many, but at first the exchange feels like relief on both sides. He also rewards the Praetorian Guard, the men who can keep or unmake an emperor in a night. Macro stands beside him as the practical architect of security, and the public sees stability. For a time, the regime looks almost like a restoration. Caligula attends meetings, speaks respectfully, and lets aristocrats believe they will matter again. Rome's upper classes, bruised by Tiberius' late reign, try to convince themselves that youthful energy means mercy. Ordinary Romans, hungry for festivals and grain, see full stands at the circus and hear musicians in the streets. On the Palatine, doors that had felt sealed now feel merely guarded. Even the risks of a young ruler are disguised by the glow of novelty. Caligula is inexperienced, and his popularity is personal, not institutional. The same crowds that roar approval can also demand blood when disappointed. The same Senate that votes honors can also whisper about liberty when frightened. Underneath the applause lies the hard fact that the emperor still controls courts, soldiers, and money, only now the hand is younger. We can anchor these months in coins that advertise dynastic continuity, in inscriptions recording honors, and in narratives by Suetonius and Dio that, despite their later hostility, agree he began well. Josephus notes the early goodwill reaching beyond Rome. But in late AD 37, a sudden illness will change the rhythm of the court, and the hope of spring will thin into suspicion. When the emperor's body falters, Rome will learn how quickly affection can curdle into fear. In the autumn of AD 37, the city that had shouted his name begins to whisper a new question. Will the emperor live? Caligula falls seriously ill, and for a moment Rome confronts the terrifying truth that its hope rests on one young body. The ancient writers love to mark this illness as the turning point. Suetonius and Dio describe a recovery followed by a harsher, more suspicious ruler. We cannot test the medical details. Fever, seizure, poisoning are all later guesses, but we can trace what follows in actions. Caligula begins to treat the people closest to him as potential threats. Those who had made private plans for a succession or even prayed aloud for his death now look exposed. Very soon, Caligula removes rivals inside the imperial household. Tiberius Gemellus, once named by Tiberius as a co-heir, is accused of plotting or of seeking medicine to imitate the emperor's illness, charges that read like palace paranoia but end in an execution. Macro, the Praetorian prefect who helped raise Caligula, is dismissed and forced into suicide, his wife Ennia implicated in disgrace. These are not random victims. They are the men who controlled the guard and the alternate heir whose name could rally opposition. The change is felt immediately on the Palatine. Courtiers learn that yesterday's ally can become today's traitor, not because evidence changed, but because the emperor's trust did. Senators see treason language return to public life. The guard senses danger too. A new prefect, new loyalties, and an emperor who has learned how precarious his throne truly is. In the circus, the crowds still chant, but behind the cheering stands a tightening grip. At dinners, cups are watched. In the Senate House, pauses feel dangerous. Was this a rupture caused by illness, or a political calculus that the illness merely accelerated? Sources disagree, and we should not pretend to know Caligula's inner mind. What we can say is that after late AD 37, the reign's early gentleness is harder to find in the record, while fear becomes easier. Suetonius and Dio provide the drama. Josephus confirms that key figures fall. Later references to new guard leadership and public executions fit the pattern. The coins do not announce the terror, but the sudden disappearance of certain names from favor is itself a kind of negative evidence. With rivals removed, Caligula faces a Senate that has offered him everything and expects gratitude in return. Instead, the relationship will slide into a contest of humiliation and control. In the Senate House, a man rises to speak and realizes the hardest task is not finding words. It is guessing what tone will keep him alive. After the purge of AD 37, Caligula's relationship with Rome's aristocracy shifts from partnership to performance, and the stage is public. The Senate had greeted him with extravagant honors, and at first he accepted them as proof of loyalty. Then he begins to treat those honors as leverage. Ancient authors describe sessions where he mocks senatorial dignity, forcing men of consular rank to stand for long hours, to applaud on command, or to endure jokes that cannot be answered. Some episodes may be embroidered, but the pattern fits a ruler asserting that no ancient privilege outranks the emperor's will. Caligula also uses appointments as signals. He grants and withdraws offices abruptly, sometimes elevating men of lower status to remind the nobility that pedigree is not power. He appears at meetings less as first among equals and more as a master testing servants. Suetonius and Dio claim he sometimes spoke of bringing back the republic only to watch senators panic at the idea of losing imperial protection. Whether or not the exact lines were spoken, the effect is credible. Uncertainty becomes a tool. Humiliation politics creates enemies quickly. Senators who can endure taxation can still break under disgrace, because reputation is their currency. When an emperor makes a joke about a man's ancestry or courage, the laughter around the room becomes a public vote of survival. Some men respond with deeper flattery. Others begin to imagine the unthinkable, that Rome would be safer if the emperor were gone. In the city, ordinary Romans see only pieces of this. They watch Caligula in processions, hear his voice in the theater, and judge him by games, grain, and spectacle. The Senate's wounds are quieter, hidden behind marble and ritual. Yet senatorial hostility matters, because senators write histories, fund gossip, and communicate with provincial elites. If Caligula wins the street but loses the ruling class, he will be remembered through a hostile lens. Tacitus' direct account for these years is missing, but his surviving style shows how bitter the senatorial memory of humiliation could be. Suetonius and Dio supply scenes of insult. Josephus notes the political tension in Rome. Inscriptions reveal an official world still praising the emperor even as private confidence drains away. As the Senate learns to fear his unpredictability, Caligula turns more towards spectacle and personal display, where applause is immediate and dissent can be drowned out. Soon the action will shift to the glittering Bay of Naples, where engineering and ego meet the sea. Along Baiae's shoreline, wealthy Romans pause with their cups midair, staring at a road where no road should be. Sometime around AD 39, Caligula orders ships to be lashed together across part of the Bay of Naples, forming a floating causeway between the fashionable resorts of Baiae and the area near Puteoli. If the scene happened as later writers describe, it would have been unforgettable. Anchors groaning, planks laid, soldiers posted like on a city street, and the emperor riding back and forth over open water, wrapped in military finery. Suetonius adds a story that an astrologer once said Caligula had as much chance of crossing the bay on horseback as becoming emperor, and that the bridge was built to spite that prophecy. Cassius Dio emphasizes the cost and the theatrical arrogance. We cannot verify every flourish, but the episode fits a ruler using engineering as a declaration of personal power. Baiae is not Rome, it is Rome's playground. The elite keep villas there, and the sea breeze offers cover for private talk. Caligula brings the court with him, moving between banquets, baths, and stage displays of authority. To friends, this might look like youthful bravado. To enemies, it looks like a ruler treating the empire as scenery. The blurred line between theater and government matters because it shapes perception. In Rome, a speech in the Senate can be contested by murmurs. At Baiae, the emperor controls the audience, courtiers, guards, invited aristocrats, and the sea itself as backdrop. He can reward laughter, punish silence, and turn marvels into loyalty tests. The same pattern appears in smaller episodes the sources report: sudden commands, extravagant costumes, and public games that place him at the center as performer and judge. Yet spectacle is not only vanity. It is also a message to the army and provinces. The emperor can command resources, move fleets, and bend nature, at least for a moment. In a world without mass media, a floating bridge becomes news carried by sailors and merchants to every port. Suetonius and Dio are our main narrators for Baiae's extravagance. Archaeology along the Bay of Naples reminds us how dense the imperial villa landscape was. Coins of the period continue to project power and divine favor. Later hostile anecdotes may magnify the tone, but likely preserve real impressions. The problem is simple. Spectacle costs money, and applause does not pay the bill. Soon Caligula's need for resources will harden into coercion, and the laughter of Baiae will sound different back in Rome. In the Forum, a senator raises his hand at an auction and realizes he is not bidding to win, he is bidding to survive. By AD 39–40, the cheerful spending of Caligula's early months collides with a hard limit. The empire's resources are vast, but the emperor's appetite for display is faster. Ancient writers insist that Tiberius left a large surplus in the treasury, and that Caligula burned through it with games, donations, and construction. Exact figures are uncertain and may be rhetorical, but the shift is visible in the methods reported next. Caligula searches for money in ways that create enemies. Confiscations follow prosecutions. Wealthy men find themselves accused of vague disloyalty, and their estates are taken into the imperial house. Families learn to dread a summons to the Palatine because the summons can be the beginning of ruin. Suetonius describes forced sales and auctions where Caligula sits as master of ceremonies, pushing prices higher, sometimes compelling senators to buy useless luxuries at absurd sums. Dio reports new levies and creative penalties. The details vary, but the common thread is coercion disguised as commerce. In a society where honor is tied to generosity, being publicly fleeced is also being publicly shamed. Who benefits? Those closest to the court, favorites, certain freedmen, and above all the Praetorian Guard, who expect donatives and are now more expensive to keep loyal. Some provincials may feel little immediate change, but Rome's elite feel the heat first, because their wealth is concentrated, visible, and politically useful to seize. Resentment hardens into something more durable than fear, a belief that the emperor is not merely dangerous, but predatory. At the same time, Caligula's public image begins to fracture. The crowd still enjoys games, but shortages and rumors travel quickly through a city dependent on imported grain. When people hear that rich men have been ruined, they do not pity them. Yet they do wonder what happens when there are no more rich men to ruin. Even the laughter at the circus can carry a nervous edge. Suetonius and Dio are frank about financial coercion. Josephus hints at the broader instability such methods create. Inscriptions show continued official loyalty in cities that still needed imperial favor. The absence of open revolt in Italy reminds us that fear still worked. With money and honor both weaponized, Caligula looks outward for a stage that can restore his aura of command. Soon he will take the court north to the Rhine frontier, where soldiers measure emperors by different standards. On the Rhine, the winter air bites through cloaks, and veterans watch the new emperor's face as closely as they watch the enemy's woods. In AD 39, Caligula leaves Rome and heads for the northern frontier, moving through Gaul to the great military camps along the river that had once been his childhood world. For the soldiers, this is not theater. It is pay, discipline, and survival. Ancient sources report that Caligula reviewed troops, demanded strict standards, and punished failures with sudden severity. A serious conspiracy is said to have been uncovered involving the governor Lentulus Catullus and others. Executions follow, and the court learns that distance from Rome does not mean safety. The evidence for every detail is uneven, but the reign's pattern, swift accusations, harsh outcomes, appears again on the frontier. Caligula also gathers a fleet and marches toward the Channel coast, to the region around Gesoriacum, Boulogne. Later writers mock what happens there. Suetonius claims he drew up the army facing the sea and ordered men to gather shells as spoils of the ocean. Dio laughs at a victory over Neptune. It is tempting to take these stories at face value, because they are memorable, but we should be cautious. The coast is also where an invasion of Britain would be staged, and preparations that stall, due to weather, logistics, or politics, could later be redescribed as farce by enemies. What did the troops experience? Long marches, strict inspections, sudden rewards, and the unsettling sight of an emperor who could be generous one day and lethal the next. Some may have cheered him, especially if donatives flowed. Others may have feared him, especially if punishments were public. In any case, the northern tour spreads his fame beyond the city and gives him a martial posture he craved, even if no decisive campaign was fought. Suetonius and Dio supply the mocking details. Inscriptions and the archaeology of Rhine forts confirm how real and massive the frontier system was. Later imperial practices show that channel preparations were normal for a British expedition. Josephus, focused elsewhere, offers little correction. When Caligula returns to Rome, he brings back a sharper sense of command and a growing taste for divine honors that will collide with provincial realities. Soon a crisis in Judea will force the empire to ask how far an emperor's pride can go. In Rome, incense rises and an altar glints, and the question is no longer who rules, but what is he allowed to be? By AD 40, Caligula's court language and public staging increasingly push toward divinity, not merely honoring the gods, but placing the emperor among them. Roman emperors had long accepted divine honors in the provinces and after death, but living God talk in the capital was explosive. Our sources describe Caligula appearing in costumes associated with Jupiter, Apollo, or Venus, and encouraging worship that blurred the old line between princeps and deity. Some of this may be hostile caricature, yet there are hard realities behind it. Temples and priests for the imperial cult existed across the empire, and the emperor's image was already sacred in many cities. The sharpest collision comes in Judea. Jews in Jerusalem worship one God and forbid images in the temple. At the same time, the eastern Mediterranean is tense, with Greek and Jewish communities clashing in Alexandria and delegations pleading their case to Rome. Into this, Caligula orders that his statue be set up in the Jerusalem temple. For the local population, this is not a political insult. It is a religious catastrophe. The governor of Syria, Publius Petronius, is tasked with carrying out the order. Josephus describes Petronius assembling troops, hearing Jewish crowds begging him to delay, and choosing postponement rather than immediate slaughter. Philo, writing as part of the Alexandrian Jewish embassy, portrays Caligula as furious and capricious, a man who cannot imagine limits. Both authors have reasons to emphasize the danger, but they agree on the stakes, an imperial command that could spark mass resistance and bloodshed. Then, at the last moment, the crisis eases. Negotiations, delays, and interventions, especially by Herod Agrippa I, a client king with access to the emperor, help prevent the statue from being installed before Caligula's death. The empire avoids open war in Judea, but only barely, and the episode becomes a lasting proof text for Caligula's arrogance in later memory. Philo and Josephus are the key witnesses for this confrontation. Dio and Suetonius echo the theme of divine pretensions. Inscriptions from the wider empire show how normal imperial cult honors were, even if Rome itself hesitated. Back in Rome, demanding worship does not bring security. It multiplies enemies, because it turns disagreement into sacrilege. And inside the palace, men who have learned to fear him begin to study the moment when fear could be replaced by action. A Praetorian officer answers a routine order, and the emperor turns it into a joke that everyone must laugh at. Inside Caligula's court, fear is no longer an occasional weather. It becomes the air people breathe. Even laughter sounds rehearsed. Ancient writers list cruelties in rapid succession, sudden executions, humiliations at banquets, men forced to watch friends die, and noble families ruined for words spoken years earlier. Some of these scenes may be shaped for shock, yet the underlying reality, that powerful Romans felt unsafe, is supported by the fact that conspiracies begin to form and by the speed with which many later accept the assassination. The court's private life also becomes part of the story, though here we must be most cautious. Suetonius and Dio report sexual scandals, accusations of affairs, coerced relationships, and even incest with his sisters. These claims fit the ancient habit of discrediting rulers by attacking their bedrooms, and we cannot prove the most extreme charges. What we can observe is the public political use of family. Caligula elevates his sisters to unprecedented honors, then later exiles Agrippina and Julia Livilla when they become linked, fairly or not, to plots and rivalries. Caligula's own marriages are similarly public. He is reported to have taken Livia Orestilla briefly, then to have married and divorced again, and finally to have lived with Milonia Caesonia, who remains with him to the end and bears a daughter. In a monarchy without an official constitution, the emperor's household is politics, because heirs and alliances live there. Among the guards, resentment grows personal. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune, is mocked for his voice and masculinity in hostile accounts, insulted with obscene passwords and public ridicule. Whether every taunt occurred is written, the mechanism is believable. A ruler who humiliates armed men is gambling with his life. Suetonius and Dio supply the darkest anecdotes. Josephus, more restrained, still shows a court where men feel trapped. The sudden prominence and disappearance of relatives is reflected in honors and punishments recorded in our sources. The lack of surviving Tacitus for these years removes a potential check. By late AD 40, the palace is full of people who have learned to smile while planning escape. Soon, those plans will narrow to one solution: strike first and strike very close. A handful of officers take positions as if for ceremony, but their hands are set for murder. On January 24, AD 41, during public games in Rome, in the middle of an ordinary festival day, the plot against Caligula moves from whisper to blade. Josephus gives one of the clearest narratives. Chaerea and fellow conspirators recruit men within the Praetorian Guard and among palace attendants, choosing a moment when the emperor will be moving through a narrow passage with limited escort. Suetonius and Dio agree on the essentials, though they differ in details: who struck first, how many wounds, and exactly where in the palace complex the attack unfolded. The location is usually described as a covered corridor or cryptoporticus, a place designed to move unseen between rooms and theaters. Caligula leaves the spectacle and steps into the passageway. Chaerea approaches with a request, some say for the day's password, then strikes. Others follow immediately. The emperor shouts, tries to rise, and is cut down. A few loyalists attempt resistance, but confusion is the assassin's ally. The guard is split, and in that split the regime dies. What happens next is as brutal as the assassination itself. The conspirators do not only want a dead emperor, they want no revenge in the form of an heir. Josephus reports that Caligula's wife Caesonia is killed, and their young daughter is murdered as well. The stories differ in exact method, but the intention is chillingly consistent: wipe the household clean, remove a rallying point, and prevent a civil war fought over a child. Outside, Rome surges with panic. Some senators hope this is the moment to restore liberty, meaning the end of one-man rule. Others fear the army will answer with slaughter. The Praetorians, meanwhile, are suddenly free to choose the next emperor or to seize power for themselves. In the palace, servants hide, freedmen destroy or protect records as best they can, and ambitious men listen for which names are being shouted in the halls. Josephus anchors the sequence. Suetonius and Dio add vivid, sometimes theatrical touches. Later tradition fills gaps with sharp dialogue that is hard to verify. The physical layout of the Palatine, still traceable in archaeology, reminds us how easily a narrow corridor can become a trap in close quarters. With Caligula dead, Rome has hours, not days, to decide whether the empire can survive without a princeps. In the chaos, one overlooked man will step from behind a curtain into history. In a dark corner of the palace, an older man trembles as boots approach, expecting death and finding an imperial acclamation instead. After the assassination, the Praetorian Guard discovers Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding among curtains and storage spaces, and in the most improvised of coronations, soldiers lift him as the new emperor. The Senate reacts with a rush of old dreams and new terror. Some members speak of restoring the Republic, meaning rule without a princeps, but they do so inside a city filled with armed men who are not taking orders from the Curia. Meetings stretch and fracture, factions form, and no one can be sure whether the Guard will negotiate or massacre. Meanwhile, the Praetorians bring Claudius to their camp and demand recognition. The balance of power is visible to everyone. The Senate can debate, the Guard can decide. Claudius buys loyalty with a donative, setting a precedent that will haunt future emperors. The conspirators, having removed one ruler, find they have not removed the system. Cheria and other plotters are arrested. Josephus describes their execution. Suetonius and Dio present it as swift and exemplary. Rome's political class learns a grim lesson. Killing an emperor may be possible, but steering the aftermath is harder. Caligula's memory is attacked almost immediately. Statues are pulled down or recarved, inscriptions altered, and official praise quietly withdrawn. Later writers call this damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, though the practice is uneven. Some images survive because stone is stubborn and local pride resists Rome's orders. Claudius also moves to stabilize the city, confirming officials, calming the grain supply, and signaling that the terror of sudden accusations should ease, at least for now. Yet the new emperor cannot simply declare Caligula a madness and move on. He inherits the same court, the same guard, and the same imperial machinery. He must punish enough to look strong, forgive enough to avoid endless revenge, and persuade provinces that the center still holds. Josephus is essential for the day-by-day scramble. Dio and Suetonius add the senatorial mood and the guard's role. Inscriptions showing erased names give physical proof of the cleanup. Coinage quickly shifts to Claudius' portrait, announcing continuity through a new face. But the real struggle is over the story. Who gets to define Caligula now that he cannot answer? Soon we will sift the legacy, what we can prove, what we can doubt, and why the monster portrait endured. A century after the knives, a writer opens his notebook and chooses which stories will outlive the marble. Most of what later generations know about Caligula comes through authors who did not witness his private orders, and that distance matters. Suetonius writes in the early 2nd century, collecting anecdotes that read like courtroom gossip, sharp, memorable, and often hard to check. Cassius Dio, writing even later, frames Caligula as a warning about unchecked power and senatorial humiliation. Tacitus, who might have supplied a tighter political narrative, largely fails us here because his books for these exact years are lost. By contrast, Philo and Josephus are closer in time and describe specific crises, the Alexandrian tensions and the Judaea statue confrontation, which both authors present as a near disaster with named officials and clear geography. What can we say with reasonable confidence? Caligula came to power amid genuine hope in AD 37, and early gestures of generosity are widely reported. After late AD 37, the regime's tone hardens. Key figures fall, including Gemellus and Macro, and elite politics grows more dangerous. He pushed imperial divinity further in Rome's own public culture than earlier Julio-Claudian practice usually allowed, and the Judea crisis is strongly anchored by Philo and Josephus. He traveled to the Rhine frontier and the Channel coast, and whatever later mockery implies, moving the court and army, there was a real act of rule. Finally, he was assassinated in January AD 41 by men of his own guard. What is harder to prove are the most spectacular claims, perfect one-liners, neatly staged comic scenes, and the most extreme sexual and cruelty stories. They may preserve kernels, extravagance, humiliation, sudden violence, but they also served post-AD 41 needs. Painting Caligula as uniquely monstrous helped justify the killing, shielded the new emperor from blame, and reassured Rome that the system had removed an aberration rather than exposing a fragile arrangement. Material evidence adds restraint. Coins show a ruler advertising legitimacy through Augustus and Germanicus, not a public manifesto of madness. Inscriptions record honors granted and later erased, letting us watch reputation change in stone. Literary notices and surviving traces suggest Caligula began major works, including aqueduct projects later completed by Claudius, while the recovered ships from Lake Nemi point to extravagant engineering without telling us what meaning he attached to it. If this approach, calm, scene by scene, and evidence-aware, worked for you, please like the video and subscribe for more Roman history. In the end, Caligula's reign is a puzzle built from real acts and hostile memory, and our best tool is the steady habit of separating what happened from what was convenient to say.